Most people are of the assumption that there is such a thing as a right of return for the Palestinian refugees to Israel. What is staggering though is that this Palestinian right is enjoyed by virtually no other refugees in history. Most are unaware of this fact, and so many well-meaning people mindlessly parrot this hoax that the return of refugees is an inalienable right, which is proof of the efficacy of Hitler's tactic of the big lie that any lie, however outrageous, will eventually be believed if repeated often enough. The history of the 20th century is a lesson of the falseness of this assertion. Here are just a few examples. Millions of Muslims fled India for Pakistan, following the bloody riots of 1947. India not only stripped them of citizenship, but barred them, in its constitution, from ever returning. No one ever suggested that these Muslims had a right of return. After World War II, Czechoslovakia expelled all its German citizens. Yet no one suggested that the millions of Sudeten Germans had a right of return. In 1997, Germany even signed a treaty acknowledging the irrevocability of the expulsion. When the communists took power in Vietnam, millions of boat people fled to the United States and various Asian countries. No one has ever suggested that these people have a right of return. In the 5 years after its establishment in 1948, Israel absorbed close to 500,000 Jewish refugees, about half from the wreckage of the Holocaust, and the remainder from Arab countries. A similar number poured in over the next 3 years following expulsions in Arab states. As a result, the new state's population had doubled by 1953 and tripled by 1956. Yet no one has ever suggested that these refugees have a right of return to their countries of origin. In fact, none of these refugees were even granted monetary compensation, another inalienable right claimed for the Palestinians. Nor was there any lack of other examples that fit this pattern. Why, then, are the Palestinian refugees so unquestionably awarded a right enjoyed by virtually no other refugees in history? United Nations involvement in the Palestine refugee problem has a long history. Following the Arab rejection of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181 of November 29, 1947, which partitioned Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, a war ensued between the two communities, and then between the newly declared State of Israel and 7 Arab states. By the end of hostilities in November 1948, there were several 100,000 Arab refugees. According to the UN statistics, some 711,000 Palestinians became refugees as a result of the creation of Israel and the War of 1948. By 1950, UNRWA believed there were 900,000 refugees. Israeli sources put the number at closer to 500,000. Furthermore, it should be noted that for the most part these refugees were not expelled by the Jews, but left their homes at the request and promises of their leaders. Others left as they didn't like Jews and didn't want to live under Jewish rule. Resolution 194-3 of 11 December 1948 created the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine with the mandate to take steps to assist the governments and authorities concerned to achieve a final settlement of all questions outstanding between them. That resolution further stated that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live in peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss or damage to property. On the other hand, did you know that there are 2 different UN organizations for refugees? Namely UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, responsible for all refugees in the world, and UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Palestine refugees in the Near East, responsible solely for the Palestinian refugees. And on top of that, UNHCR also serves Palestinians who reside outside the countries where UNRWA operates. Do you want to know the staff size of both organizations? UNHCR 6.503, UNWRA 29.000. So who is a Palestinian refugee? The originating UN resolution did not define refugee. UNRWA therefore adopted its own broad definition. For operational purposes, UNRWA has defined Palestine refugee as any person whose normal place of residence was Palestine during the period 1 June 1946 to 15 May 1948, and who lost both home and means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict. Palestine refugees eligible for UNRWA assistance are mainly persons who fulfill the above definition and descendants of fathers fulfilling the definition. 3. Palestinians are the only group where descendants can inherit refugee status from parents and grandparents. Using this definition, UNRWA believes there are 4.5 million Palestinian refugees. UNRWA's definition of refugee also contrasts with that of UNHCR and the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees. A refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of their nationality, and is unable to or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail him herself of the protection of that country. So in other words, for world refugees the status of refugee ends with the first generation, and it is not inheritable, and therefore the task of the UNHCR is to resettle the refugees in their host countries and receive full citizenship. For the UNHCR, life in refugee camps is a status that has to be resolved. Contrary to that, UNRWA has a completely different order. They are regarding it as their task to supply and maintain the refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Lebanon, in Jordan and Syria, and extend it to the refugee status over generations. Adding to the refugee problem is the Arabic policy. Unlike most of history's refugees, the countries to which the Palestinians fled refused to absorb them, preferring to leave them in squalid refugee camps for the sake of encouraging anti-Israel sentiment and manipulation. The Muslims who fled India became full citizens of Pakistan. The Sudetan Germans were fully absorbed in Germany. The Vietnamese boat people are now productive citizens of the U.S. Jewish refugees from the Arab world have been fully integrated into Israel. Yet the Palestinians, whose Arab hosts bear direct responsibility for their flight, through their decision to declare war on Israel, rather than accepting the UN partition plan and declaring a second Arab state next to the former British-mandated Transjordan, still languish in refugee camps after 62 years. Jordan, at least, granted its Palestinian refugees citizenship, but made no effort to get them out of the camps. This is why refugee camps were still flourishing when Israel conquered the West Bank in 1967, after 19 years of Jordanian rule, and one must wonder why there are still refugee camps in Jordan 62 years after 1948. The vast majority of camp residents are full Jordanian citizens. Yet, because UNRWA is now a mere self-perpetuating technocracy, Jordan has no incentive to integrate these citizens into its population even today, 62 years after Israel did exactly that. Nevertheless, the refugees who fled to Jordanian-controlled territory were lucky. Those who went to Lebanon, for instance, not only were not made citizens, but were also deprived of basic civil rights.